Welcome once again to Breakfast Central. Now, Nigeria's Senate, in a communiqué issued at the end of its retreat in Ikot Ikpene, Akwa-Ibom State, has set plans in motion to amend the Electoral Act once again, this time to allow for diaspora voting, especially for presidential elections. The aim is to enable citizens such as military, paramilitary, security personnel, and other citizens to vote. In addition, the Senate plans to make electronic transmission of results mandatory from the next general elections in 2027, including the uploading of polling unit level results and result sheets used at different levels of result collation.
You'll recall that Nigeria's electoral body, INEC, in its press releases and communique before the 2023 elections, had promised Nigerians real-time election results upload. Now, this was never the case during the presidential elections. The IRF portal all of a sudden developed a running stomach and abandoned its duty rushing to use the restroom. Now that the Senate is planning to reintroduce this amendment in the Electoral Act, one can only say, well, it might seem that this is giving the case of pigs flying. Joining us this morning to have this conversation is Bode Gbadebo. He's an online editor at Leadership Newspapers. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning.
All right.
News Central.
So there's so many conversations or so many areas to this conversation that can be looked at. INEC, of course, has said that according to the Electoral Act, the body can decide whatever mode it chooses to interpret the election. So there's a conversation about the immediate upload of results electronically. There's a conversation of diaspora voting, and I'd like us to actually start with the conversation of diaspora voting. Earlier in the year, when addressing Chatham House, that part of the conversation was that currently the law does not provide for diaspora voting, but that this is something that will be looked at in the nearest future. Judging by the way the last elections went, do you perceive that Nigeria is in any way, shape or form ready for diaspora voting, and do you think that we'll be ready by 2027?
Of course, diaspora voting is an overdue thing. You will recall that before now, they have been called by Nigerians in diaspora and other stakeholders here back at home that there should be a provision for Nigerians in diaspora to actually exercise their franchise. So it's an overdue thing. And it is good that Senate, the 10th Senate at this time, is coming up with this idea, and they have resolved to actually amend the relevant section of the law, which I think is section 64 of the Electoral Act 2022, to allow for diaspora voting. And according to the community, which I also saw at the weekend, this will be for a start, at least at the level of the presidential election. But for me, I would say this shouldn't be a presidential election. It should also encompass election for National Assembly members and election for 36 state governors of the Federation.
So now, I want to quickly, permit me to quickly interject, please. I hear you when you say that it's a long overdue conversation. This is a conversation that Nigerians in diaspora have been pushing for the longest time. And even Nigerians here, back at home, agree that it's a long overdue conversation. But the question is, does INEC have the capacity? In 2022, INEC said it had the capacity, even when the National Assembly had struck out the motion for the commencement of the enablement of Nigerians in the diaspora to vote. So whilst that was struck out, and the INEC did say that it was capable, if you look at the facts on ground, the way the elections were carried out in 2023, the anomalies that presented itself, with some people not being able to find their voting, their polling units, all the irregularities that marred the elections in 2023, do you think, beyond it being valid that they should vote, do you think that INEC has the capacity to handle diaspora voting now and in 2027?
Yes, for me, INEC has the capacity to actually do that. And, the diaspora voting thing will be probably by way of electronic voting, because INEC may not be able to deploy staff physically to about 160 or 150 foreign missions of Nigeria across the world. So INEC will, of course, lack that capacity to deploy staff to be physically present. So if we're able to get this through, it will also afford us an opportunity to have something similar to electronic voting, because those Nigerians, for now they say those unessential services, those that abroad, not by their own making, but those who we sent there for one assignment or the other, diplomatic workers, paramilitary, military officers, defense attaches across our embassies and missions. Probably even medical, every other essential worker we have sent abroad for one thing or the other, but for official purposes. So if they are to vote, definitely there should be a kind of technology that will allow them to vote there, and we record their voting back here in Nigeria. So that will give us a kind of a leverage to achieve electronic voting. And if we can start with that on a larger scale, I believe one day we also embrace electronic voting in Nigeria.
You trust the electronic?
Has the capacity.
Sorry, you trust the technological capacity that we have right now? Do you trust it? With people saying that the beavers had issues, there were glitches here and there. Do you trust that the technology will not fail this time?
Okay, with the way they've been, you wanted to say with the way they've been implementing what we even have now,
yes,
whether they can do better. Well, it's about political will. Even the transfer of result thing that the INEC actually exploited the law to Bogu was also a deliberate thing, because when the Senate, I think the 9th Senate was making the Electoral Act 2022, you recall what some of the senators did. Some of them, before the camera, stood up and complained and there were no internet penetration in their localities and constituency, which is not true, because wherever you have banking service, wherever you can use your phone, then that means you should be able to use internet. I know our internet or broadband penetration in Nigeria is not 100%, but at least it's something to write home about. So it's achievable, it's possible with the political will on the part of all stakeholders, Nigerians, INEC, civil society organization, and the political gladiators who also are the one, giving their culture of political impunity, They are the one that have been bastardizing our electoral process. So, irrespective of the outcome and the processes involved in the 2023 general election, if INEC can change a new leaf, it can turn a new leaf with the right political will, it's achievable, it's possible.
Well, I mean, the challenge is, all these are based on ifs. If we have the political will, like you've mentioned, because they're also talking about making electronic transmission of results mandatory, which should have been the case in 2023, because that was the understanding that Nigerians had. But now we're pushing it to 2027. It almost feels like we've accepted 2023, the way that the election was held, and we're just going to move on and try again in 2027. And so let's get your thoughts on, mandatory electronic transmission of results. Do you also see that as likely? Are we going to see a situation once again where there's one loophole here or there, that INEC is able to escape being committed to electronic transmission of results?
If the National Assembly is able to tinker with Section 77, Section 77, Subsection 3 of the Electoral Act 2020 as amended, there won't be an escape route for INEC again. And let me tell you what happened in the case of 2023 general election. Yes, you recall back in the build-ups to the general election, INEC chairman, Professor Mahmoud Yakubu, actually promised Nigerians that there will be electronic transmission of results. And when the elections were held, the story changed. And you saw the consequent, agitations, noise, and a lot of condemnation of the conduct of the election by INEC. And you also recall the drama that played out at the National Collation Center when the presidential election results were being collated. Agents of some political parties, particularly opposition, rose up and said, no, they can't go ahead except INEC is able to transmit the result electronically, because according to them, what they recorded at various polling units were different from what was being reeled out in Abuja at that time. And in order to avoid these things, they are actually cast aspersions on the credibility of the electoral process. Now INEC, now Senate is resolving after its retreat that, okay, we will also have to tinker with Section 77, subsection 3 of the Electoral Act 2020 as amended to make it compulsory for INEC to transmit election results, and even the result sheet of every election should also be uploaded through the instrumentality of BVAS, that is a bimodal voter accreditation system. Now, the reason is that INEC exploited the lacuna in the current Electoral Act 2022 as amended, because the National for electronic voting actually to choose to do the right thing or not. So when you have the latitude to choose between evil and good, so you can see you may also at the end of the day decide not to choose good and choose bad. So there was a lacuna in the sense that the National Assembly made it open for INEC that, okay, because of complaints of internet penetration problem and the rest of them, INEC can choose to transmit the election results, and it may choose not to do it. Now, the Senate or the National Assembly has realized what majority of Nigerians wanted, or what we want, as the case may be. So now they are now saying, okay, we will tinker with that section 77 subsection 3 to make it compulsory. By implication, in the next election cycle in 2027, there will not be excuse whatsoever by INEC on whether to transmit election results or not. What it means is that if the amendment is able to pass through and assented to by the President of the Federal Republic, becoming a law, so INEC will have no choice than to obey the law, which is transmission of election results. And the advantage is there will be less agitation, there will be less complaints, there will be, a lot of things will be more transparent and credible, and of course, we won't be where we are today.
Yeah, well,
given the number of
one thing you just mentioned is that INEC exploited the lacuna. I mean, doesn't that just sound very scary, that your country's own independent electoral body is looking for loopholes through which it can bypass, the process and make it not free and fair? That's what it almost sounds like. That the electoral body that has the responsibility of carrying out the most credible elections, more than 300 billion naira was awarded to INEC to carry out those elections, was still looking out for loopholes and a lacuna to exploit, so it wouldn't give Nigerians a credible election. And so, should INEC be trusted for any reason to carry out any elections in the future in Nigeria, regardless of whatever laws are placed, by the National Assembly? Should Mahmoud Yakubu, if he's still INEC, president by then, be given the right to carry out any elections in Nigeria ever again?
Well, I will not say whether INEC was looking for a lacuna or not. Probably INEC just stumbled on the lacuna. Probably they were not looking for it, but when they saw it, of course, they make use of it for their own convenience, to rationalize anything or any error they might have, committed during the conduct of the 2023 general election. But going forward, if the National Assembly is able to actually carry out this amendment, because truth be told, there are a lot of lacunas with the 2022 Electoral Act as amended, and that tells you the reason for the humongous number of election litigations currently before the courts. You can see them, even though some were dismissed, but you can see the number. That number shows that the conduct of the 2023 general election at whatever level, whether the State House of Assembly level, whether governorship level, whether the National Assembly election level, or the presidential election, it shows that credibility was not 100%. And you can also recall the reports, most of the reports of election observers, whether local or foreign election observer, which I believe INEC must have learned its lesson and must have also resolved by this time that, okay, election henceforth, people are dragging us too much. Elections henceforth will be more credible, more transparent, and more acceptable to all our stakeholders. And INEC have an opportunity in the next 2 weeks or so, less than 2 weeks, to actually turn a new leaf in the forthcoming off-cycle governorship elections in Imo, Bayelsa, and Kogi State. So for me, we can only make our fingers crossed and see what comes out from the Imo, Kogi, and Bayelsa election to see whether INEC will be turning a new leaf or not, preparatory to the
Mr.
2027
would you advise that we also figure out better punitive measures for situations like this? Because what you've said now, and I know that you're not speaking on behalf of INEC or representing INEC here, so let's just be clear. But what you've said, maybe paints a picture of what the thinking is like for a cross-section of Nigerians. You've said that INEC, would, feel bad that, they are dragging us. That is a term we'll probably use on social media, for trivial issues. But we're talking about an election, to determine the fate of 200 million people. And to date, we haven't seen that any INEC official, ad hoc staff, anybody whatsoever has been punished for carrying out those elections that many people, including international observers, saw as completely flawed to a large extent. It has basically determined what Nigeria will be shaped like for the next 4 years on the presidential, National Assembly, and governorship level. But INEC doesn't feel, like there would be any punitive measures. Neither do INEC staff, neither do any of. There's maybe a handful of cases that would be overturned by the court. But do you think that maybe we should figure out more ways with which to enforce the laws that govern INEC and the electoral process in Nigeria? Because there's places here that, have 6 months jail time, 500,000 naira fine. It exists in the laws, but nobody seems to be taking them serious. So should National Assembly also maybe be looking at those aspects?
Yes, of course, that should be punitive measure for every violation. And we also, I think after this show, find time to also go through the whole Electoral Act 2022, whether it is just there to specify or make provision for some things, while no backup in terms of punitive measure in case those provisions of the law are violated. But, INEC as an institution cannot engender a credible electoral process for Nigeria. INEC is just one body. For us to achieve a credible electoral system, all stakeholders must be on the same page. All stakeholders, political gladiators, political parties, the rest of Nigerians, CSOs, and the rest of them, and INEC. Everybody must be on board to agree that, yes, we want to draw a line from this point going forward. We want to turn a new leaf. Because if we continue to drag INEC, and we as citizens are not helping matters, political parties are observing rules in breach, political gladiators go about with culture of impunity, then we can never achieve credible electoral process. Even if angels will come down and be the workers in INEC. So INEC alone is not involved. All of us, we must all have our hands on deck so that we can achieve this. And yes, I know there are some, provision for punishment, but then INEC is overwhelmed, I will tell you. So it's also important we unbundle INEC so that the burden will be lessened and it will make the electoral umpire to be more effective, more efficient at all times. Remember the case of the Adamawa resident electoral commissioner, Udu Hari, who was suspended. If you recall,
yes, we do.
In the wake of that governorship scandal in Adamawa, it was INEC that first reacted by saying, okay, we didn't appoint you and we don't have power to remove you. The president appointed you for INEC and you were confirmed for that position by the Senate. So INEC now wrote the executive. President Muhammadu Buhari, this is what you breach our laws, do something. Office of the then Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Mr. Boss Mustafa, wrote to INEC and wrote to Udu Hari, suspending him from his office. And you also recall that INEC initiated a lawsuit to prosecute Udu Hari for what he did. But where are we today? INEC is not the court, INEC is not the police. The prosecution of Udu Hari, the suspended resident electoral commissioner in Adamawa, is stalled as we speak, not because INEC is not interested in prosecuting him, but because the process of prosecuting him goes beyond the confines of INEC. It's taking place on another territory, on the judicial territory.
All right. So from
now it has been stopped because some things are not on ground, and that's not the fault of INEC. So you can see that all of us must agree to do the right thing.
If I hear you clearly, it's not just INEC that is to blame here. There are several other arms, excuse me, several other arms that should be blamed because it's a collective effort. Now, you did mention that INEC is overwhelmed and that INEC needs to be unbundled, and I'm glad that you mentioned that because that's part of the conversation that the Senate had. What would that picture look like, the unbundling of INEC? What would it look like?
All right. I don't have the details of the intendment of Senate of the Federal Republic, what they intended doing. Yes, they plan to amend the Electoral Act 2022 as amended. But if you recall, in the last assembly, that's the 9th assembly, there was a bill. I don't know, it wasn't passed. They called it Electoral Offenses Commission. If that bill is to be passed today, the functions of prosecuting electoral offenders will be removed from INEC for another independent commission, which will fight corruption in the electoral sector. So what does that tell you? It means INEC will be more committed, more focused on conducting election. Why another independent commission, that is Electoral Offenses Commission, if the bill is eventually passed into law someday, will be on the lookout for people who are hell-bent on truncating or soiling our electoral system. So this commission, we identify them, we arrest them, and we prosecute them in court. And what is the essence? The essence is not for showmanship. The essence is to send the right signal to will-be offenders that it's no longer business as usual. So for me, that's one idea of unbundling INEC.
All right. Mr. Bode Gbadebo, thank you so much for joining us and speaking with us about these initiatives. We do hope to hear in the coming days more, maybe a clearer picture from the Senate, as well as maybe responses from INEC as well.
It's my pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
There probably would also be a bit more sincerity, of purpose when we see that the National Assembly is able to summon the INEC chairman.
Because there are lots of questions that have remained unanswered from the last elections. And if we're going to be able to proceed with this whole, they're great grand suggestions, but it's just ideas. Yeah. For you to be able to go forward, you need to look back, look at the mistakes that you made, and how do we ensure that these mistakes do not repeat themselves?
Very true. And once again, what happens when these things play out? Nigeria for a long time has almost not been able to punish bad behavior. And it feels like, people would argue that the reward for bad behavior in Nigeria is more work.
It's worse behavior.
It's more work. They renew your time in office, they extend your time in office, and that's the reward for bad behavior. But if Nigeria is a country that sees that when you fail at your role, you are punished adequately, or you're suspended, or you're fired, then maybe people would act better. The National Assembly itself has not been able to invite any of these persons the departments and institutions that they handle are failing woefully to have them, answer questions to Nigerians. You see the same National Assembly invite, a person, and the person would ignore them. So when they make these laws, well, good and fine. They can enact these new laws. They can, make adjustments to what the Constitution says or the Act says. But, what happens when they are ignored? For me, is a big question. And of course, the judiciary, what role are they also playing in all of this?
Because he did raise a very valid point there as to how, it's important that when the INEC does its part, there are arrests being made, investigations being done. What next? I think it's an important conversation to have, especially with the diaspora voting. This last election, a lot of Nigerians in the diaspora complained bitterly about not being afforded the opportunity to vote.